Stay hungry, stay foolish.
In business, government, and every aspect of contemporary life, business leaders are struggling to find workable solutions to today's biggest complex challenges. As a former Pentagon official and CEO of a billion-dollar organization, our guest has seen firsthand that the current models for solving diverse problem sets no longer works. Organizations and individuals need to adopt an entirely different approach to the biggest challenges they face and embrace a new model to ensure they emerge triumphant. That model is called a Renaissance campaign. We welcome author of the Renaissance campaign, a problem-solving formula for your biggest challenges. John Rogers, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much.
It's fantastic to have you on the show, John. I really enjoyed the book. It's so full of practical knowledge of how to drive change. And we'll get into what the Renaissance element is, what the campaign element is, because you divulge all that as the book goes on. But I wanted to start by citing the amount of disruption and change we're experiencing, and that no matter how big or small our challenges, there are always ways to manage the disruptions of our world, but we need new tools to do so. And these are tools you have discovered through failure, through success, and of all places in 15th century Italy.
So when the Renaissance came about, it was on the tail end of the plague. And the plague had decimated Europe and decimated Florence. And as part of that, the Medici family, which was a banking family in Florence, committed to rebuild and had a vision to rebuild Florence. And they realized that a lot of the people, a lot of the craftsmen who they would initially call upon were deceased because of the plague. And so they had to figure out how to do this a different way. So they started to bring together the creatives, Michelangelo and Da Vinci and others, to help them visualize and think what Florence could look like. And through that confluence, through that mixed table of bringing different people to bear on this problem, they created a city that is arguably one of the most beautiful cities in the world, one of the most progressive cities in the world in terms of its design and its architecture, and one of the most enduring cities in the world, Florence.
And John, one of the things you mentioned here was, okay, we're in the backdrop of this plague. I thought how serendipitous of this book, because it talks about this moment of dramatic change in the backdrop of a crisis of sorts. And, you know, when you look back, if you were to zoom out from the history of mankind, humankind on this planet, we've had crisis after crisis, and we keep bouncing back and we keep coming back stronger and stronger. But one thing has changed dramatically, and that is the onset of this digital world. And you liken it to the introduction of the printing press into the world, that all of a sudden we're able to educate ourselves more. And because we're able to educate ourselves more, opinions became more and more diverse.
Yeah, it changed everything. And it took, back with the Gutenberg press, we had to rely on before the Gutenberg press, we relied on the church. Humanity relied on the church for its information, its knowledge. And then the Gutenberg press was a great equalizer. People actually could start to learn for themselves. They did, they read, they understood, and it changed the world. It created just part of the Renaissance, right? Fast forward to the digital age. At the beginning of the digital age, our sources for information the way I describe it, were vertical in nature. They were funneled in nature. The funnel was like this, and it was, the networks and there was a series of agreed upon sources, by which people got their news, their information. The internet has changed that. The digital era has changed all that. So now it's, of course, like that. It's completely opened up, and there's both blessing and curse in those words. And we've, but one thing, regardless of good or bad, we know that disruption is here, and it's here to stay.
And one of the things you talk about, which is a huge issue, and something we've brought up on the show before, John, is that we're encouraged to study so narrowly and seek expertise in a field and climb to the top of a ladder and not jump to another ladder. And this is a huge challenge in today's society, where we become, even though the internet's there and knowledge can be shared widely, we actually got to go through a filter bubble, an echo chamber, and discover a piece of knowledge and keep going down that rabbit hole at the expense of a bigger picture.
Yeah, it's a problem for us. I mean, we've got great specialists, and we need the specialists. It is not to say we don't need specialists, but we also need generalists, and we need to understand. Different perspectives. I talk frequently about how we all suffer from rigidity of thought, and and we all suffer from rigidity of thought. And it's not only our education, it's our social upbringing, it's our we're demographically where we fit, geographically where we are. It's all of these different things socially that make up our own set of rigidities of thought. And one of the things that a leader must do is make sure that they're constantly listening and working hard to break through that rigidity of thought. I call it, I refer to it as being a prisoner of our own perspectives. And so how do you break out of prison? Well, what they did back in the Renaissance, what the Medici family did, and indeed what we do with the mixed tables that we pull together, is they very intentionally bring together those who they otherwise wouldn't talk to help them address and solve those problems, so that they're getting different perspectives. It doesn't mean that they don't have the subject matter experts at hand. They do, and they should. But it means that it's not just limited to those.
Yeah, and we'll talk deeply about mixed tables because it's a core lesson from this book. It's one of the things you really want to impart from the book, and something you describe so deeply that you leave us with no choice but to adopt this brilliant mindset. But to bring it to life a little bit, you share a story of a friend of yours from DARPA, and this is where the mixed table brought to life the connection between social networks and cancer.
Yeah. So, as you know, being as esteemed and involved as you are in the digital world, social networks, social movements have been a subject of great study and interest. And this was after the Arab Spring. And one of the things that some of the folks that I was talking with and working with at the Department of Defense were looking at was how information flows in social networks. And a really brilliant researcher had an idea that, well, perhaps that flow of information and how those digits move operate similarly to how cancers move and how research moves with regards to cancer. And so he took on a study that looked at different pockets of research, and if he could connect all of them, what would he learn that hadn't been learned before? And of course, the advent of really strong supercomputing allowed him and others to do these kinds of analysis that, heretofore were not one couldn't do. And so he looked at that model, so that he could, on the one hand, work to solve and help address cancer, and on the other hand, really take a look at this thorny, knotty national security issue from a different perspective. So I just thought it was a really interesting way he went about it, and I wanted to include it in the book.
Yeah. And to give a nod to somebody else who also adopted this holistic thinking, where you got it from, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, is to honor you as well, your parents, because you'd mentioned your mother and how she used holistic thinking to crack the Joycean code.
Well, being in Dublin, you probably know a thing or two about Joyce. And you probably know a thing or two more about Joyce than I did. But my mother, and I must admit, and I deeply apologize if I'm offending you or Aidan or any of your listeners, but Joyce was always really hard for me to read. But my mother loved reading Joyce. And there was a mystery in Ulysses that for years hadn't been solved, and there was a riddle that was hidden in it. And my mother, by the way, also happened to be a singer, and she was the longest serving singer at the Chicago Symphony Chorus. She sang under Margaret Hillis and George Schulte, and she was a trained musician in that she went to school, Roosevelt University, for music theory, and really understood the theory of music. And what I also didn't know about James Joyce is that he was a musician, a really strong musician. And had he not proven to be a brilliant author, his biographers would have said that he would have that's where he would have tried to earn his living. Well, my mom read Ulysses and heard about the riddle and all this, and she just looked up and said, well, it's a fugue. And the academics, who were not musically trained, well, what are you talking about? No, it's a fugue. Here's the structure right here. And she breaks it apart for them. And because Joyce was a musician and she was a musician, she was able to bring a different perspective to bear to something that other Joycean scholars who are not musically trained could never see. And so it's all about one's perspective.
And you build on that then to build upon the Joycean code. You talk about how you cracked the IEDs, the detection of IEDs, and I'll let you explain what that is and how it came about.
Well, I would say that we contributed versus cracked for the sake of accuracy from my vantage point, because a lot of people worked really hard on this problem. And IEDs are roadside bombs. And in Iraq and Afghanistan, Allied forces were really being harmed and hurt by the roadside bombs, by IEDs. And the question, lots of questions were framed around how to identify them. But one of the things that we were asked to look for is, activating the entertainment community and the national security / Hollywood network, is can you identify any telltale signs? What are the TTMs, TTPs? And what are the signs that the adversaries would leave out there? Well, it was a filmmaker who we were working with at the time identified it and said, listen, it's the shot. If you look at what they're doing, they're recording all of these, and they're recording all these attacks for propaganda purposes. So they have to get the camera shot as to where they're going to place that bomb, and thus, if you look at it from where they're going to shoot it from, then you can detect more easily where the bomb is going to reside, where they're going to lay the bomb. And so it turned out that there was real merit to that hypothesis. And not only was that able to be incorporated into training of U.S. and allied forces, but it was also incorporated into simulation systems so that we could help those soldiers identify when they saw something in advance, that there was when they saw a topography, that there was a chance that there may be a roadside bomb there. So it all was intended to help save lives.
So speaking of great stories, John, you share a great story of your meeting with Les Aspin, and this was one that changed the course of your life. Les ultimately became one of my mentors. And he was one of my first interactions with Les. I had just been hired as his district director. He was a congressman from southeastern Wisconsin. He was the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. And I went into a staff meeting with him, which is the one I think you're referring to here, Aidan. And we had just passed, and I was responsible for this, the National Clean Lakes Program. And the reason we had restored and passed a law for the National Clean Lakes Program was to restore this little lake in southeastern Wisconsin called Delavan Lake. And I was full of myself at that time. I just thought, boy, this is really cool. We have changed the course of U.S. law, and that we're gonna clean up the environment. We've passed this big bill, and he starts grilling me and on how this one little lake is going to be cleaned up, and he went on and on. And he wanted to know how they were going to drain it, and how they were going to kill the fish, and how they were going to rebuild it, and how they were going to put in the water, and how many wells would be impacted, and question after question. And I've had this, I'm 20 something years old. I've had this huge victory, and I'm thinking to myself, what are you doing? I'm getting more and more agitated as he's drilling harder and harder. And I'm thinking to myself, man, this is just ridiculous. And my face is getting red. And at the end of it, he says, John, don't get mad. I was just curious. And that mindset, the mindset of curiosity, the mindset of really understanding and taking the time to be curious about the questions that you are grappling with and the issues that you have, has stuck with me forever. It has stuck with me forever. Because you have to be curious. You have to listen. You have to ask good questions. You have to be present, and you have to be mindful. And Aspen instilled that in me in a way that changed my life. And I've tried to carry that forward every day ever since. By the way, I absolutely got that from the book, John, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to share it with our audience here on the Innovation Show. I wanted to share that mindset. It's so valuable. It's so valuable in any what you call campaign, change, transformation, personal, change your habits, whatever it may be. Campaigns are done this way, and you're highly experienced in it. And you mentioned something else to do with Les, which was later on in the 80s. Les was the chairman of the House of Armed Services Committee at a time when Democrats were perceived as soft on defense. And you used the technique of what you mentioned earlier on, mixed tables, to change all that.
And I was a pup of a staffer, but it was something that also changed my life. And so here we are. We're at the end of the Cold War, and we are. There's profound changes, and Aspen was really trying hard to work through the issues of what the U.S. foreign policy and NATO's policies were going to be post-Cold War. And he embarked on a series of meetings around the country where he would bring together people who would not talk to each other, but for Aspin convening. So he'd put a retired Army, or Air Force, or a general flag officer together with an industry executive from defense, and those two would normally talk to each other, next to a brilliant sociology or political science professor from a university who wouldn't talk with them, next to a campaign operative who would never talk to them, next to a local political leader who barely knew any of these guys. So that he could start to assemble different perspectives around really complex problems. Now, part of that was, as any leader does, he certainly had his thoughts going into those meetings as to what different possibilities were, and what the more likely scenarios were for the future of, for what foreign policy was going to look like. That said, he didn't have it all, and he recognized that he didn't have it all. And so he wanted to get those different perspectives. And through that process, it became a really refined set of set of policies and analysis around those policies that to this day serve in many respects as the underpinnings of post-Cold War U.S. foreign policy and domestic policy. I remember at the time he said that, one of the challenges that we're going to have in the U.S. Is that the Cold War was a great unifier. Didn't matter if you were a Republican or a Democrat, you had a common enemy. And he posed the question, without that common enemy, and Lord knows no one wants enemies, no one wants war, no one wants those things, but he posed the academic, intellectually a valid question. Without that enemy, what will society look like? And will it remain cohesive, or will it start to shred apart as a result? And clearly, he was on to something there, because we do not have that set of united principles that we did 50 years ago or 40 years ago in this country.
Absolutely. And hopefully we've seen parts of that unification thanks to the common enemy of this pandemic that we're all fighting against. But we're still not there yet, as you say, John.
We still have, part of the problem with the digital era and the news cycle that we were talking about, the informational sources we were talking about before, is that people believe whatever they want to believe anymore, so that it's things that are emotionally convenient for them. That's what they believe versus what the facts tell them.
As we mentioned, the filter bubbles keep them there as well, so it doesn't get them into the mixed table mindset.
It's a big, hard problem, Aidan.
It is, man, isn't it? Yeah, it's one we're gonna have to find a solution to some way if we're gonna reunite.
Absolutely, totally agree.
Yeah,
Love to work with you on that solution.
It's one of the things that drives me, John, with this information that we share on the show. Behind me is all these brilliant authors like yourself. Every week, share that knowledge that just I don't feel is out there enough, and if I can contribute towards that in some little way, that's the goal of this. So, moving on, I'd love to come back to, you mentioned some stuff there. For example, the psychological warfare that happens at mixed tables, particularly at the start before a purpose is set, etc. And we'll go through the 6 steps of setting up a table and a successful campaign. But I wanted to mention, really to give credit to you and to the work that you and Michael J. Fox have done for the Parkinson's Action Network as well. So you've used mixed tables here to great effect as well. So maybe we'll say a word on that, just to also acknowledge that work that you're doing on behalf of humanity. And indeed, so is Michael J. Fox.
The work with Michael was some of the most rewarding work of my entire career. And it really, it was asking the question related to the stem cells quote unquote wars campaigns back in the early 2000s, mid 2000s. What aren't we doing from a public policy perspective? What were we missing? There was great advocacy effort and great success with that advocacy up on Capitol Hill and in the legislature, but it could only go so far. So Michael called me up one day and said, "I want to do something about this." And I said, "Michael, you don't need a guy like me. You need a kid." And he said, "No, I really want to do something about this." And I said I'd be happy to help. I flew to New York and we met, and we realized that if you played offense, most celebrities play what I refer to as defense when it comes to politics and policy. They take incoming calls from elected officials who ask them to do something versus offense. I'm going to set an agenda and go try to move something. And Michael wanted to play offense. And as a rugby player, you understand, and an athlete, you understand that well. And so we put together a campaign with the intention of flipping the U.S. Senate at a time that nobody thought it could be done. And indeed, the U.S. Senate flipped, in no small part because of Michael's work on stem cells. And by looking at the whole public policy perspective through the lens of a mixed table of what's not being done, we were able to have a profound impact on that by then orchestrating a campaign to flip the U.S. Senate.
And we'll get into the process and the mindset and the structure and the mental frameworks of how to do that now by looking deeper at what a mixed table is. And before we do, just so you know, John, so many of our audience are CEOs, transformation workers, change makers in their organizations, entrepreneurs, startup founders, etc. So they're all leading campaigns, even those of us who are doing it for ourselves. Maybe it's a new habit in 2021, whatever it may be. But I really found this interesting. So if you bring any diverse group of people together, like you said, the first thing that you can almost see the thought bubbles sticking out of their heads, and they're kind of going, what am I doing here? Why is he here? Why is she there? And all of a sudden, it's like, why are we all being brought together? And so many of us in change have done that and tried to create a mixed table. And I often think of it, John, like the idea of the watering hole, where the gazelle can drink freely with the lion, and then afterwards it's back into the silos, back into warfare when it's open season. But there's a quote I wanted to share from the book, and it goes as follows: if we really want to advance society, intelligent, insightful people must be able to share their real thoughts without fear of backlash, and at a mixed table, done well, can provide exactly that opportunity. So let's use that as a way to share the process. So it's a 6-step process, and maybe I'll let you take over here at where the process begins.
So the 6-step process is on the campaign side. Let me say a couple things here. What I was trying to communicate there is that a mixed table done well can become a safe space to take on really hard, wicked hard problems in a way that kill the naysayers within an organization and enable organizations to and leaders of organizations to really address those stubborn, recalcitrant issues that they've been challenged with. And the way to do that is a little formulaic from my perspective. You of course have your team, your subject matter experts, then bring in thought leaders from the outside, then bring in creatives, as in, people from the stage, from theater, people from Hollywood, people from the music industry, artists, people who are paid to create. Because what I have found is that by bringing in the creatives into the discussion, vastly changes what that table feels like. And so it's not just the same old people with the same old preconceived notions. You really are mixing it up. And so that was to me, that's the kernel of the idea for people to change how they organize and structure their process for mixed tables. After that, after you go through the mixed table process, you work through what the outcome to the challenges that you're facing are, what the outcomes are. Then it switches into campaign mode. One of my sayings is that life is a campaign. It's actually a series of millions of campaigns that we all run every day. We just don't call them campaigns. But they all have the same common architecture. They all have the same chassis. And so if you look at life being a campaign with the same chassis, then it just gets easier. So, you and I getting on this podcast together, it's campaign. You have an objective. You set some context around it. We're Zooming versus FaceTiming versus using Microsoft. We're doing that, and you map out the process of what it's going to look like, and then from mapping out the process, you develop a set of strategies for things you want to talk about and where you want to go, and then you have some tactics, some arrows in your quiver that you're gonna specifically ask me about, and you've got those ready, and you're pulling the arrows at the right time and pulling them in, and then you execute, and that's a campaign. And we do that all of the time, every day. We do that when our spouse asked us to go to the grocery store, and we got to come up with a list, and we do that when we are running a sales and marketing campaign or a go-to-market campaign. And we do that when we're running a cybersecurity campaign. And we do that when we're acquiring or selling our businesses. It's the same set of fundamentals. But understanding those fundamentals and what to do with those fundamentals is where it breaks down. And so from my vantage point, my contention is that if we could put light on them and bring them to the top of people's minds so that they understand where they're at in the campaign, they can then be more intentional about that campaign and make it a lot easier.
You mentioned the creatives there. That will intrigue people because many of these organizations actually contain those type of people. They actually work in those organizations, yet they'll bring in outside consultants from the big consultancy companies and overlook the very gems they have right in front of them. And you mentioned earlier on about the IEDs and bringing in the Hollywood directors, but also you mentioned Hollywood had a massive impact post 9/11 with the Department of Defense, another great example.
Yeah, I mean, so the 9/11 Commission report identified the lack of imagination as one of the underpinnings that led to 9/11. After all, who could envision somebody flying airplanes into buildings as a form of terrorist attack and using our airline industry as tools of weapons of mass destruction? Well, Hollywood could, writers could. In fact, Tom Clancy, in a book a few years before that, had a plane flying into the U.S. Capitol, decimating the U.S. Capitol, the leadership, and that was the premise of the book. And so, one of the things that we started to do, we had an Army Assistant Secretary come to me and some of my partners at the time and ask us to start assembling different creatives to help them think through different problem sets. And at my company, Leaders, what RL does is serves as the nexus between the national security communities and the entertainment communities to take on these really wicked hard problems. Now, we've expanded that mission over time, but at our heart, we still are very much in the business of being at that nexus. So again, bringing people together who otherwise wouldn't talk to each other to look at problem sets. But the creative is at the core of the methodology, but creatives are unique. And that, what I'm thinking about with a creative, because I would argue that virtually, almost everybody's got some semblance of creativity in them. What I'm talking about with creatives are paid Imagineers used to working under a time budget. Paid Imagineers used to working under a time budget. These are people who are paid to imagine things for a living, and are used to having to produce a product in short order, which is why I love the Hollywood writers, right? Because the Hollywood writers, if they're working on a sitcom or a drama or wherever, they've got to produce product in very short order, and they have to do so creatively. And they are wonderful researchers in very short order because that's what they're paid to do. And then you take what I just said and transfer it over to blue sky thinking, right? What executive wouldn't want a paid Imagineer used to working under a time budget as part of their process? Blue sky activities can go on and on and on and on. They could just drone on forever and drive leadership nuts, right? So that's why you take this process, because you can condense that activity by an order of magnitude and get a lot higher output as a result.
Let's move from blue sky thinking to blue pill thinking, because another great campaign you share is the repositioning of the drug Viagra. That
was a law of unintended consequences, right? So Viagra was initially created to be a heart medication, and Pfizer quickly recognized that it had other impacts and completely changed. And they understood the context, and they completely changed, how that medication was used, marketed, distributed, and they completely changed their campaign around it from where it was initially, why and how it was initially created.
And for a deeper dive into that, John shares it in the book. But one thing I wanted to really ensure that we get out of today's show is the makeup and the numbers involved in a mixed table, because John goes to this granularity of how to run these campaigns. John, I really felt you really want to just get this out into the world, and it was one of the reasons I really wanted to have you on the show. But let's talk about that. You talk about the ideal size of a mixed table, and then you go into mentioning what you called an associative barrier.
I'm going to answer the question a little bit differently, only in that we find ourselves in a different world, namely the COVID world. And so our mixed tables have been very intimate, immersive experiences. Typically 24 people, that's my optimum number, whereby you have 3 breakout groups of 8. And so you have this plenary session of the 24, and then you're giving each group different questions to solve, and each one of those subgroups of 8 comes back after a period of an hour or 2 hours to report to the broader group of what they've solved / the progress they've made on the question that we've given them. And it's very iterative. It goes in and out. We, of course, can't do that or won't do that in the COVID world. One of the things I've been doing is working with the CDC Foundation and others on messaging, on activating the entertainment community with regards to messaging of COVID. And what I would say is that it's every bit as bad as we think it is, and then a whole lot worse. And so we have subsequently started a series of Zoom events. We call them our post-pandemic series, what does the world look like in a post-pandemic manner, for national security, for the economy, for education, for public health, and what should policymakers and leaders be thinking about as it relates to these topics. And in the context of that, Aidan, what we've been doing is groups of 8 to 10 people. We find 10 people is the maximum number of people that we could put on Zoom. 8's a fine number. So with an 8, it's something like four subject matter experts, 2 thought leaders, and 2 creatives. Again, the same formula, just truncated down in terms of the size, the overall size. And then from there, also condensing the period of time that we're on Zoom just because of Zoom fatigue that everybody's experiencing. So, since I've written the book, we've been forced to, and COVID has disrupted us. We've been forced to evolve that. We'll go back to our core mixed tables in the future, but for the time being, our entire post-pandemic series is Zoom-based.
I wanted to share as well the physical world, because we will get out of this, John. And what I found really interesting was you mentioned the actual makeup. So you mentioned, for example, thought leaders there. And I found that's an unusual board that will maybe adopt those people. Not many. It's starting to happen more and more where people are seeing the value of neurodiversity. And, I think this is really important, that an overlooked point with diversity is that what you're really looking for is diversity of opinion and thought, not gender.
Diversity is important, but that's not what I'm talking about. And they're not, I'm talking about diversity of thought. Now, that doesn't mean they can't be the same, but that means there needs to be intentionality around them not being the same. Because you really, in order for organizations to thrive, you really want to make sure you're getting the broadest set of opinions with knowledge around those set of opinions, versus diversity as it's commonly thought of today. I'm all in favor of inclusiveness, and I think that's a really important thing for organizations to strive for and to succeed at. But I also think it's important to have that intellectual diversity.
I mentioned in the last question, John, I loaded you up with lots of stuff, but one of them was this idea of what you call an associative barrier.
We have barriers that are put up, and the associative barrier we have beliefs by association, and the groups that we put together, reinforce that. And so we want to make sure that we're not living in our own bubble, words you said earlier. And the mixed table process is a way to help break that down.
You've upgraded for oral leaders the world with the post-COVID world, but in the physical world, in the where we can meet and interact world, you have a very precise structure over this. So, for example, the 3 nights, feeding people well. I think this is really important, John, because the granularity you go to is really useful to understand why you do those things. Why do you feed people well? Why do you make them feel at ease? All those things are really important to get the best results.
It goes to this basic principle. People learn when there's an emotional connection. And so you want to create an emotional connection. And put a different way, you want to immerse them in that experience. So you want people very relaxed. You want to give them food. You probably don't want to. We've really intentionally stayed away from alcohol or anything, just in terms of the event, because we want people clear-minded. Once in a while on the last night, we'll serve some wine or something, or on a separate night, take people out to dinner, really let people get to know each other. So if you could do a 4-day in-person panel, it's all in the evenings. And the first evening starts about 5, goes to about 9. You're doing introductions and feeding them from 5:30 to 6:30. Then you're you're doing almost a mini TED type talk, back to the granularity you're looking for here, Aidan. You're doing a mini TED type talk to kick it off, and then the moderators come and start to frame some of the larger issues that they're contending with, why it's all brought together. Then you're breaking out these different groups. So again, the 4-2-2, 4 subject matter experts, 2 thought leaders, 2 creatives, maybe 4-1-3, 4 subject matter experts, 1 thought leader, 3 creatives, something along those lines. And they're given a specific challenge / question to work on. Think Hollywood storyboard model. So really, we've taken the Hollywood storyboard model and the national security red team model, and put both of those together so that we are getting the best out of the national security and the Hollywood community, working through those questions. And then they go back to the larger plenary session, and in front of all their peers, they talk about what they have found, why, how they're approaching the problem. And then over the next couple of days, if you have the 4 days, literally on night 2, throw them a party. Let everybody get to know each other. Let everybody really start to work well. And the first day, as I describe it, you alluded to this earlier, Aidan, everybody's body language is kind of like this. It's just, why am I here? Oh my God. And by the end of it, it's, oh my God, this is the most interesting thing I've ever experienced in my life. And so it really is interesting to see that occur. And every time we've done it, we've seen it occur.
I thought next, John, we might share the various types of campaigns. And I'm just going to share my screen here. For those people who are watching us, I have up there the 4x4 matrix that you use to describe this. So maybe we'll talk through this with empathy for those people who are just listening to the show.
You have big and small campaigns, and you have internal and external campaigns. And again, all of the campaigns, as I mentioned a moment ago, have the same architecture. And a big external campaign might be to develop a plan to enact a piece of legislation. It could be climate change, it could be public health, it could be gun control, it could be whatever. That's a big external campaign. A small internal campaign might be, I want to lose 20 pounds by summer. Again, they have similar architectures. You have an objective that you have to identify. You have to understand context. Now, the context and the mapping of the process and the strategy and the tactics are, in my opinion, clearly much more complex on the big external campaigns than they are the small internal campaigns. But nevertheless, the common elements are, again, you want to identify your outcome. I want to pass a piece of legislation. I want to lose the weight. You need to understand context. And I think that context, Aidan, is perhaps the area of the campaign that people most frequently overlook. And the context, to put it a different way, is the milieu in which you are operating in. What is that environment? What does the world look like that you're operating in as you're trying to do this? I mean, I'll pick on the United States. Clearly passing a law on climate change, or gun control in a Republican-held with the House and Senate in Republican hands and the presidency in Republican hands, has on the surface a lot lower chance of success contextually than if you were to do that you looking at it, the dynamic was reversed. And so you really have to think through and understand context, because it sets the tone as to what you can achieve and what you can't. Because you have to be smart about this. From there, you have to map the process. Well, in the case of losing that weight, you know that you have a couple different levers that you can dial in on. You can cut down your calories and your intake, or you can increase your exercise and your output and your calories burned. And so those are your basic dials of your map. On the big campaign, that process is exponentially more complex. But you really do need to understand that process. You need to understand how a bill becomes law. You need to understand, all of the different, you have to be curious. You have to understand all of the different components, everything that goes into that. What are all the subcommittees? What are all the committees of jurisdiction? What are the executive agencies that will be asked for input? What is the time frame involved in your legislative calendar? Whatever it is, the point is that you have a process that you have to map it. You have to know, as part of your map, you have to really understand who your decision makers are. Same thing parenthetically for sales. And I find that on the sales and on the BD side, organization after organization forgets to map that process. Who are they targeting? Why would they want to buy? What authorities do they have? What authorities don't they have? And then from there, you can start to build strategies. And I say strategies versus a strategy, in that because of that context, my view is you have to identify 2 or 3 strategies to run your campaign, because if you get shut off at one point in time, you can continue on and go on. And then you have your tactics, the actual things that you are doing to achieve your campaign. Back to your small little campaign, you're joining Weight Watchers. You're exercising a half hour a day. You are eating the Atkins diet, whatever it is. And then, of course, you have to execute. You got to go do it. So it's one thing to talk about doing it. It's another thing to actually go doing it. And so that's the campaign.
And most of us, John, jump straight into execute, into the tactics of things without doing the pre-thought, because it's difficult and it takes a lot of mental energy. But there was a couple of things I wanted to share. One was, you mentioned context and you mentioned BDE and understanding who the buyer was, and you humbly share an incident here that happened to you where it cost you a very lucrative contract.
Yeah, we should have known better. But we let our enthusiasm get the best of us. We had developed a really significant simulation system called the IED battle drill. So think about a 270-degree curved screen that's 25 feet high and 25 feet across and 10 feet high, with then picture a Humvee in the middle of it on a flatbed of a truck. And that Humvee, you could detonate from 4 to 8 Gs to simulate an IED blast, with real smoke coming out and 4D sound, and it was a really impressive weapon. It was a really impressive training system. And what we were told was that it was the highest level of simulation system ever built for ground troops. It rivaled flight trainers. And again, this was all about helping the troops identify and not identify IEDs. The organization that had paid for it within the Army was the Department of Defense, was an organization called the Joint IED Defeat Organization. and they came to us and said, we want you to do this, and we want a bunch of these, and you start with these prototypes, and then we're going to hand it over to the Army, and the Army is going to buy them. Well, a funny thing happened on the way to the forum. The Army said, hey, this isn't our budget. We don't want this. And by the way, we don't like Giotto because we can do this. We can do this better and smarter. And so it was a great learning lesson.
And thank you for sharing it. And thanks for sharing the book, because it really gives context to what you're talking about. One last thing I wanted to share, which is so important, is that you talk about the difference between working on a campaign and working in the campaign. And more importantly, that the team of people, the mixed table, may need to change. And oftentimes, the reason I share this is so many innovation teams or innovation departments in organizations come up with the idea. They may ideate, they may come up with a plan, etc. And then oftentimes it's swooped off them and given to a different team to execute, and they can take it like an insult, but it often isn't. And you share this because they're different mindsets. There's an execute mindset, and then there's an ideation mindset. Like you talked about the creatives who come up with the idea in the first place. I thought this was wonderful and a really important thing to share.
Thank you for that. It's the difference between working on and in the business, and working on and in an idea. So sometimes I think it's easy for organizations to do just what you did described, which is to conflate the two teams. They may or may not be the same teams. As a practical matter, there'll be some overlap, but I would suggest that almost always they're not the same teams. You want different teams to help you think about that big, hard problem, to inject that creativity, versus those who are going to go get it done for you. And so I think that the key to that is being transparent, providing clarity on the front end, so that nobody gets their feelings hurt.
I pulled a passage that I absolutely loved, and I'd love to share it as my sign off today. I'll read it out because I can't memorize it, but while I'm doing that, if you have a think about how you'd like to sign off, because you wrote this for a reason. There was a clear reason why you wrote this, and I'd love you to share that. But before I do, where can people find you, find the RL Leaders, find out more about your work, the book, etc.? rlleaders.com, and come to our website. We'd love to engage with you, and you can find me at john@360.com, John Rogers at 360.com. And so we love you to come to the website and the blog, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to get on the phone with you, FaceTime with you, and take it to the next level. And I'll let you think about that sign off. Mine is as follows. I love this. We're not in the midst of a renaissance. We're not in our own version of the Middle Ages either, but we could slip into either one. How we proceed as a society will partially depend on how we evolve. There isn't time for limited thinking. We must be holistic and thoughtful, fostering a world that deals in creativity and civility rather than narrow-mindedness and belligerence. The more holistic our thinking, the more we will create, the more problems we will solve, the more we will shape a world worthy of future generations. Beautiful, John. Beautiful way to sign off. What about you? We're all prisoners of our own perspective. Make sure that you wake up every day, remain curious, and strive to break through your own rigidity of thought. And if you do that and you realize that the most important thing that we can do is to bring it all to the table every day, treat everybody with kindness and respect, and go do great things, you're going to do just fine. Author of The Renaissance Campaign, a problem-solving formula for your biggest challenges, John Rogers. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for joining us. Aidan, thank you. Have a great day.